The millionaire's son fired all the nannies, but protected this maid. The wind from San Francisco Bay carried the salty mist toward the glass-walled house overlooking the water. Inside, the elegant stillness of the hillside mansion was torn apart by a child's scream. "Daddy! Daddy! She's going to hurt me!" 4-year-old Noah Callahan, his blue eyes brimming with tears, clung to his father's hand. The boy pressed himself against the tall man, standing frozen beside the low-backed sofa. At the living room doorway, the new nanny halted mid-step. She was the 14th in 6 months. Ethan Callahan went rigid. A man who had once drawn an entire skyline with buildings bearing his name now stood helpless before a child weighing barely 10 kilos. In his left hand, the freshly signed employment contract was still clipped inside a folder. In his right, his son's small fingers gripped so tightly they burned. "It's all right, Noah," Ethan said softly, forcing calm into his voice. "She's here just to play with you." But the boy shook his head again and again, his cries breaking into jagged sobs. "No, she's bad. She's going to hurt me." He pointed toward the nanny, a woman in her 30s, hair neatly pinned, uniform crisp and spotless. She instinctively stepped back, fear flickering in her eyes. On the low shelf, Teddy the bear lay tipped on his side, knocked from his usual place. The electric fireplace cast a pale golden glow across the wooden floor, yet the room felt cold. From the kitchen doorway, the housekeeper, Mrs. Jenkins, peeked out hesitantly. "Mr. Ethan." She had witnessed this scene too many times to be surprised, though her voice carried deep pity. "It's all right, Mrs. Jenkins," Ethan murmured, eyes fixed on his son. "I'll handle it." He crouched and lifted Noah into his arms. The small body trembled violently against his chest. It had been 8 months since that rainy night, the night Claire's car skidded off the slick hillside road, ambulance lights slashing through the storm. Since then, every woman who crossed this threshold to care for Noah had been driven away by the same panic. No logic could break the invisible wall between Noah and the world. "Mr. Callahan," the nanny began gently, guilt in her tone. "Perhaps another—" "No," Noah screamed, burying his face deeper in his father's shirt. "Never again!" Ethan swallowed the sting in his throat. He turned to the nanny, managing a polite but hollow smile. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience. We'll pay in full as agreed. Laura will reach out." The last sentence came automatically. He knew his assistant, Laura Kim, would not be surprised by yet another cancellation. The nanny nodded and slipped out. When the front door clicked shut, Noah's sobs began to fade. He sniffled, lifting tear-streaked eyes. "Daddy, the bad lady's gone?" "She's gone," Ethan whispered. "It's just you and me now." Noah stretched for Teddy. Ethan picked up the bear, and as he handed it over, caught a faint trace of Claire's favorite perfume, the delicate white flower scent she'd called "my garden I carry with me." His eyes blurred for an instant. "Are you hungry?" Mrs. Jenkins asked kindly. "I've got toast with peanut butter." Noah nodded. Ethan set him down and let the boy follow her into the kitchen. He remained standing in the living room, shoulders sagging as if a skyscraper had bent under a sudden gust. On the wall, the blueprint of a Bayside project hung perfectly straight. Bold lines, flawless symmetry. Out in the world, Ethan controlled everything: budgets, schedules, numbers. Inside this house, he was defeated by 2 words: "Mommy, please." Noah came running back, fingers sticky with peanut butter, crumbs on his lips. He tilted his head, watching a cloud drift past the skylight. "Daddy," he asked, "is Mommy up in the clouds?" The question struck Ethan's heart like a nail. He knelt, wiping the boy's hands and meeting his gaze. "Mommy's in a place where she can always see you," he said hoarsely, "and she wants you to be safe." Then he called toward the kitchen, voice rough from sleepless nights. "Mrs. Jenkins, could you keep an eye on Noah this afternoon?" The silver-haired woman looked up from the soup she was stirring and smiled warmly. "With pleasure, Mr. Callahan. The young man and I make quite the team." Noah giggled, reaching for her, his only sense of safety in the house where the bay winds whispered through the glass every evening. Perhaps because Mrs. Jenkins never tried to fill the space his mother left behind. That afternoon, in his 35th floor office overlooking the sunset-lit San Francisco Bay, Ethan sat in silence before the window. Among scattered blueprints and the low hum of wind against glass, he picked up the phone. "Laura, I want to post a new hiring notice," he said, his voice low and tired. "Same as before?" came her quick reply. Ethan shook his head, eyes still on the glowing horizon. "No, this time it's different. I don't want degrees or glowing recommendations. I want someone real, someone who understands children, not through books, but through the heart." That same afternoon, in the 36-story office tower in downtown San Francisco, Grace Moreno was bent over, wiping the long glass table in the conference room. Under the fluorescent lights, white circles of light reflected off her sun-kissed cheeks and the rough hands worn from cleaning chemicals. It had been 3 years since she'd started this job, cleaning for a large financial firm. She worked the evening shift from 3 in the afternoon until nearly 10 at night, when the last employees finally left the building. The work was steady, but monotonous and exhausting. Sometimes she would pause by the huge glass windows and look down at the glowing streets below, where life seemed to move one heartbeat faster than hers. Grace was 25, but her brown eyes carried the calm of someone who had grown up too quickly. Her mother, Rosa, had been a seamstress who worked 16-hour days to support 4 children in a poor neighborhood of the Mission District. When her father left, Grace was only 12. From that day, she studied, took care of her siblings, and did whatever small jobs she could to help her mother. "You were born with hands that can soothe," her mother used to say. And it was true. In their neighborhood, everyone came to Grace when they needed someone to watch their children. From difficult toddlers to autistic kids, every child eventually quieted in her presence. But poverty left her no chance to study early childhood education as she dreamed. Instead, she had to choose something steady, working as a cleaner for a service company. That evening, while cleaning the 35th floor, Grace leaned against the wall, tired, and peeled off her rubber gloves. She glanced at her watch. 6:30. 2 more floors to go before she could go home. Cold air slipped in through the window seam, carrying the faint scent of rain from the bay. She pulled her jacket tighter and pushed her cleaning cart toward the service elevator. Then something small but fateful happened. A crumpled sheet of paper drifted across the floor, caught by the wind, and stopped at her feet. Grace bent to pick it up, ready to toss it in the trash, but her eyes paused on a few bolded lines. Childcare position for a 4-year-old boy. No degree required. No agency. Seeking someone with real experience who truly loves children. Salary, $5,000 a month. Live-in position. Contact, Laura Kim, Callahan Designs. Grace read it once, then again. 5,000. The number made her dizzy. She was earning less than $1,000 a month, half of which she sent to her mother to help raise her siblings. Her shared apartment on the outskirts of the city barely fit 2 single beds and a small dining table. With that salary, she could help her mother finally stop working. Her youngest brother could go to college, like he'd always dreamed. But what made her heart race wasn't the money, it was the line. No degree required, seeking someone with real experience with children. Grace bit her lip. She did have experience, and she had a kind of love many people in this city had long forgotten. All she lacked was a chance. That night, back in the cramped apartment, she boiled water for a cheap cup of tea and looked at the neatly folded paper on the table. Outside, the sound of a streetcar's bell mingled with the soft patter of rain against the glass. "Is this too reckless, Grace?" she whispered to herself. "A cleaning girl calling the home of the rich to ask for a nanny job?" But her mother's voice echoed in her head. "Don't ever let anyone tell you that kindness isn't valuable." Grace took a deep breath, picked up the phone, and dialed the number printed on the page. "Callahan Designs, this is Laura Kim." The woman's voice was low, professional. "Hello, ma'am. I'm calling about the childcare position," Grace said softly, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "My name is Grace Moreno." There was a short pause before Laura asked, "Could you tell me a bit about your experience?" In that small, dimly lit room, Grace spoke about the autistic boy she had cared for over 2 years, the neighbor's twin toddlers who learned to walk under her guidance, the 6-year-old girl with emotional trauma who could only sleep when Grace sang her lullabies. When she finished, Laura was silent for a long moment, then said slowly, "I've had over 70 calls today, but you're the first one who talked about the children instead of the salary. Can you come for an interview at 10 tomorrow morning?" Grace froze. "Yes, ma'am, I can." "The address is 1320 Ocean View Road, Pacific Heights. Bring your ID and—" Laura's voice softened. "Don't worry. The little boy is special, but if you're sincere, you'll know what to do." The call ended. Grace sat still for a moment, heart pounding. She looked around the dim room, lit only by a weak yellow bulb. In the corner hung a navy blue dress she'd bought second-hand for her brother's graduation, neatly kept in a plastic cover. She would wear it. That night, she barely slept. In her mind spun faint images. A distant house, a frightened little boy, and the scent of gardenia, the same flowers her mother once grew in a pot on their tiny balcony. Before closing her eyes, Grace whispered, "Tomorrow, if they just give me a chance, I'll make that boy smile." The next morning, the San Francisco fog slowly lifted, revealing a delicate sunlight that spread like golden silk over Ocean View Road. Rows of classical villas lined the hillside, black iron gates laced with moss, bougainvillea spilling across white walls. On an old city bus turning onto that street, Grace Moreno clutched the strap of her canvas bag, her heart pounding fast. She wore the old navy blue dress she had carefully ironed the night before, her hair tied neatly back, her face lightly made up, just enough to look fresh. When the bus stopped, she took a deep breath and stepped down, her soft-soled shoes touching the stone-paved road. Before her stood house number 1320, a white mansion with curved balconies and wide glass windows facing the bay. The iron gate opened as she rang the bell. A brisk woman in her 40s wearing a light gray blouse came out. Laura Kim. "Grace Moreno?" "Yes, good morning." Laura smiled gently, her tone friendly but professional. "Mr. Callahan is waiting for you in the library. Little Noah is with the housekeeper. Please, make yourself comfortable." Grace nodded in thanks, her palms cold. As she stepped through the grand doorway, it felt as if she had crossed into another world, one without dust, without noise, where silence itself had value. On the walls hung black and white photographs of architectural works. On the shelves stood intricate wooden models of greenhouses. The air carried a blend of oak, coffee, and something faintly floral. Gardenia. That white flower scent, she knew it instantly, the same fragrance that used to drift from her mother's potted plants years ago. A deep, slightly hoarse male voice came from behind her. "Miss Moreno?" Grace turned. Ethan Callahan stood a few steps away, tall, broad-shouldered, with the tired look of someone who hadn't slept well in weeks, but with warm, cautious eyes. He extended his hand. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for giving me the opportunity," she replied. They sat facing each other in a sunlit room. Ethan asked about her previous jobs, why she loved children, and what made her think she could help Noah. Grace answered softly but firmly, "I think children don't need the best person, they just need someone who won't leave when they cry." Ethan looked up, momentarily stunned. The sentence was simple, yet it pierced the cold armor he'd built around his heart. He was about to speak when the sound of small footsteps came from the doorway. "Daddy?" A little boy with soft brown curls and bright blue eyes stood half hidden behind the door. In his arms was a worn-out teddy bear, Teddy. Ethan smiled. "Come here, son." Noah hesitated, his gaze darting toward Grace. For a brief moment, Laura, standing in the hallway, held her breath. Everyone knew this child did not approach strangers. Grace crouched slightly, her tone gentle. "Hello, Noah. Teddy's adorable." The boy stayed quiet. Then something unexpected happened. Noah stepped closer, still hugging his bear, staring at her curiously. "You smell like Mommy's flowers." The air froze. Ethan turned to his son, startled. "What flowers, buddy?" "The white ones, the ones Mommy planted in the garden." Noah's voice was barely above a whisper as he reached out to touch Grace's dress, as if confirming his thought. He didn't cry, didn't flinch, didn't back away. Grace smiled softly. "I like those flowers too, Noah." Laura pressed a hand to her chest, fighting emotion. Mrs. Jenkins, the housekeeper standing nearby, was speechless. Since Claire's passing, no one had ever seen Noah willingly approach a stranger. Ethan, still stunned, tried to keep his voice steady. "Would you like to read a story with Miss Grace?" Noah nodded. He ran to the shelf, picked a children's book, and handed it to Grace before sitting down on the rug, hugging Teddy close. Grace opened the first page, her voice light as a breeze. "Once upon a time there was a little dragon who couldn't fly. Every time he tried, he fell into the grass and cried. But one day—" As she read, Noah looked up, eyes wide, and then leaned his head gently on her shoulder. Ethan stood still, watching the scene, the sunlight streaming through the window, falling over his son's hair and Grace's dark brown strands, blending them into a single image of quiet peace. Laura glanced at Ethan and whispered, "I think we've just found the right person." Ethan didn't answer. He just watched his son, calm, smiling, for the first time in months. By the time the story ended, Noah had fallen asleep in Grace's lap. She laid the book down gently and stroked his hair. "He's a wonderful child," she murmured. "He just carries more memories than most adults can imagine." Ethan looked at her for a long time, then nodded, his voice low. "You're right." A little later, as Laura walked Grace to the gate, she said quietly, "He doesn't say much, but I'm sure you'll get a call tomorrow morning." Grace smiled, bowing her head in gratitude. As she stepped outside, the wind swept past, carrying the scent of gardenia from the garden beside the house. She stopped, inhaled deeply, and felt a strange sensation, as if this place had been calling her name for a very long time. Inside, Ethan stood by the window, watching her figure disappear down the road. Noah still slept peacefully in Mrs. Jenkins's arms. He couldn't explain what had just happened, but deep in his chest, something small, like the first flicker of light after a long winter, had quietly begun to glow. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and turned back to his office. On the desk lay the files of 16 previous nannies, all hired through the most prestigious agencies. Perfect resumes, polished photos, glowing certificates. Yet not one of them had ever managed to bring peace to Noah. Grace had none of those things. No degree, no reputation, only a pair of eyes that knew how to listen and a voice that made a frightened child feel safe. He recalled the moment Noah said, "You smell like Mommy," and the gentle smile on Grace's lips as she read the story. No one had made this house feel warm since the day Claire was gone. A soft knock sounded on the door. Laura stepped in quietly. "Have you made your decision?" Ethan turned to her, thoughtful. "She's different from the others." Laura gave a knowing smile. "Sometimes the best things for a child don't come from a resume, they come from instinct." Ethan glanced at the photo of his wife and son on the desk, then picked up the phone. His finger hovered over the keypad. For a moment, he heard again the sound of Noah's laughter, the sound he thought he would never hear again. He pressed call. The phone rang just as Grace was sitting on the bus heading home. On the screen, unknown number. "Hello, this is Ethan Callahan." Her heart skipped a beat. "Yes, hello, sir?" His voice was low and calm, but there was something deeply sincere in it. "I'd like to offer you the position. If you agree, you can start Monday." Grace was silent for a few seconds, then a small, trembling laugh escaped her, somewhere between joy and disbelief. I'm honored, sir. I promise I won't let you down." On the other end, Ethan looked down the hallway, where Noah was sitting on the floor, stacking wooden blocks into the shape of a house. "You only need to make my son smile," he said softly. "That's enough." The call ended, but both of them knew. From that very moment, their lives would never be the same again. 3 days later, Grace Moreno moved into the Callahan residence, the white mansion perched on a hillside overlooking the San Francisco Bay, where the morning mist always lingered on rows of blooming gardenias like promises left unspoken. Laura Kim arranged a small upstairs room for her, just a few steps from Noah's. From the balcony, Grace could see the garden where the wind still carried the faint scent of the boy's late mother. On her first morning, when the sunlight was still hesitating behind the birch trees, Grace was already awake. She brewed coffee for Mrs. Jenkins, helped her prepare breakfast, and wiped the kitchen counters until they gleamed like mirrors. The door creaked open softly. Noah appeared, messy brown hair, bare feet, eyes still glistening with sleep. He froze for a moment when he saw Grace pouring milk into his cup. "You're up so early," he murmured, voice drowsy. Grace smiled, her eyes warm. "There's a little dinosaur around here who keeps sleeping through breakfast, so I had to get up early to wake him." Noah blinked, then giggled. "What little dinosaur?" "The one who sleeps so much," she teased, tilting her head, "that even the sun has to wait for him to wake up." The boy burst out laughing, a clear wind chime sound that filled the kitchen. He ran off to fetch his toothbrush, humming and whistling as he went. Mrs. Jenkins stood by the stove, wooden spoon in hand, shaking her head with a tender smile. "What's your secret, Grace?" The boy hasn't laughed like that since his mother passed. Grace only answered with a gentle look. "There's no secret, ma'am. Children just need to feel safe enough to be themselves." In the days that followed, the mansion seemed to transform. There were no more midnight sobs, no more doors locked from the inside. Instead, there was laughter spilling from the child's room, the aroma of cookies baking, the sound of children's songs weaving through the steady heartbeat of a house coming back to life. In the mornings, Grace and Noah sat in the garden reading stories, letting the early light sift through the branches. In the afternoons, they baked cookies. And of course, no magic could save the kitchen from the flower storm that followed. At night, she told bedtime stories, her voice soft as evening wind. Noah would often fall asleep halfway through, his small hand still clutching hers as if afraid she might disappear. From the hallway doorway, Ethan Callahan often stood silently, watching. The man who once lived by blueprints and silence now paused mid-step, just to hear his son quietly singing, "Little Teddy cannot roar, but he can love and thank once more." The child's tender voice echoed through the warm room like a small miracle. And for the first time in many months, Ethan felt that his house, and his heart were truly alive again. That night, Noah slept soundly. Moonlight streamed through the window, falling across the blanket and washing his peaceful face in silver. Grace sat in the chair beside his bed, quietly reading a book, her eyes growing heavier as the night deepened. Outside, only the faint sound of waves could be heard in the distance. She gently closed the book and was about to stand up and return to her room when Noah suddenly stirred, murmuring in his sleep, Mommy, don't go. The water's so cold." Grace froze. His small voice trembled. His tiny hands clutched the blanket as if trying to hold on to someone. Beads of sweat glistened on his forehead. "Noah," she whispered, taking his hand. "You're just dreaming, sweetheart. I'm here." But the boy whimpered, tears slipping down his cheeks. There was a red light and so much rain. Mommy can't breathe. Grace's heart clenched. She had read the file. Claire Callahan had died in a car accident during a stormy night. But how could a 2-year-old remember something so vividly? She gently gathered the boy in her arms, her voice soft as breath. "It's all right, sweetheart. Mommy's in a warm place now." Gradually, Noah quieted. His sobs turned into faint sighs, and soon he drifted back to sleep. Grace sat still for a long time, her hand never letting go of his. Inside her, a strange feeling stirred, not fear, but connection. An invisible thread tying her, Noah, and the woman she had never met, but who somehow remained present in this house. That night, Grace Moreno dreamed. It was a gentle dream, light as a whisper. Yet when she awoke, she wasn't sure if it had been a dream or a memory from somewhere beyond time. She found herself standing in the garden behind the Callahan mansion, where the gardenias bloomed under the moonlight like hundreds of silent white souls. The scent was rich and sweet, almost tangible. Through the silvery mist, a woman emerged. Golden hair shimmered softly, a white silk dress rippled in the wind, graceful, serene, as if the moon itself had taken human form. Grace recognized her instantly, though they had never met. Claire Callahan. The woman smiled, a smile so warm it seemed to open a door inside the cold night. "Thank you," her voice came, gentle yet deep. "Thank you for coming to Noah." Grace trembled. You're his mother?" Claire nodded, her eyes filled with that kind of love only mothers who have loved beyond life can carry with them to the other side. "You didn't come here by chance, Grace," she said softly. "This place called you. Stay. Don't be afraid. Noah needs you, and so does Ethan." Grace jolted awake, her heart racing. Moonlight spilled through the curtains. It had only been a dream so vivid, so real, it left her trembling. The next morning, Ethan found Grace sitting on the front steps, a cup of coffee in her hands, her gaze distant. He could tell she hadn't slept all night. "Did the boy have another nightmare?" he asked quietly. Grace nodded. But this time it was different. He spoke very clearly about his mother's accident. Ethan froze, the cup in his hand tilting slightly. "That's impossible. Noah was only 3 when it happened. Every specialist said he couldn't possibly remember." Grace looked at him, her voice soft but steady. "It's not memory. It's emotion. Maybe he doesn't remember with his mind, but his heart still knows." Ethan fell silent. Her words stirred something deep inside him. A familiarity, a warmth that felt hauntingly close. It was the same gentle, thoughtful way Claire used to speak. He looked at Grace, a faint shiver running through him. "You know," he murmured, "sometimes I think you and Claire are strangely alike. Not just your voice, but the way you make people feel safe." Grace smiled faintly and looked away. In the days that followed, Noah's transformation became unmistakable. He began sleeping through the night, no longer crying out from his nightmares. Whenever Grace read him a story, he would hold her hand as if afraid she might disappear. One morning, as Ethan was leaving for work, Noah ran to the door and shouted, "Daddy, I love you!" Ethan froze. Those 3 words, he hadn't heard them since the day Claire died. He knelt, pulling his son into a tight embrace, tears spilling before he could stop them. Looking over Noah's shoulder, he saw Grace standing nearby, smiling softly, her eyes gentler than the morning light. That evening, when Laura stopped by to check in, she said quietly to Grace, "You know, it's not just Noah who's healing, he is too." Grace lowered her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not healing anyone. They're just remembering how to love." One night, as Grace was reading a bedtime story, Noah suddenly asked, "Miss Grace, does Mommy know you?" She paused. "Why do you ask that?" "Because Mommy said in my dream that you came from the place with the white flowers. It smells just like her room." Grace shivered. The faint scent of gardenia lingered on her blouse, the same perfume her mother had once worn. She looked at the boy, now yawning, and smiled as she brushed his hair. "Maybe your mommy sent me, sweetheart. Who knows?" Noah smiled, his eyes slowly closing. Outside the window, the rain had stopped, and the moon rose gently, laying its silver light over the garden. On the windowsill, the gardenia plant Grace had potted 3 days earlier had just bloomed its first flower. In the hallway, Ethan stood silently, watching through the crack in the door. Inside the moonlit room, his son slept peacefully, while Grace sat beside him, humming a lullaby. Her voice was soft as the wind, yet strong enough to fill every empty space in the house that had once known only silence. That afternoon, Grace was reading a story to Noah in the library when Ethan walked in. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his dark brown hair slightly tousled. The golden light of sunset reflected off the window pane, making him look both weary and unexpectedly warm. "Noah," he said gently, "why don't you go play with Mrs. Jenkins for a bit? I'd like to talk to Miss Grace." The boy nodded obediently, then leaned close to whisper in Grace's ear, "I know what Daddy's going to say." She smiled. "Oh? What is he going to say?" "He likes you," Noah replied innocently, then ran off, leaving Grace blushing, her heart pounding. Ethan stepped closer, silent for a moment. "That boy is smarter than I thought," he murmured, a faint smile on his lips. Grace took a deep breath, her fingers entwined. "What did you want to talk about, Mr. Callahan?" He frowned slightly. "Grace, how many times have I told you not to call me Mr. Callahan anymore?" She bit her lip, then said softly, "I just want to keep things professional." "And you really think that's still possible?" he asked, his voice calm but utterly sincere. The air seemed to still between them. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, as if searching for something in her eyes. "Grace," he said slowly, "when Claire died, I swore I'd never let anyone else into Noah's life, or mine. But then you came." He took a step closer, his voice lower, steady, and filled with truth. "You didn't just help Noah smile again. You brought this whole house back to life. And you reminded me what it feels like to trust, to care, to love." Grace bowed her head, tears glistening as they fell silently, catching the last light of sunset. "Ethan, I never meant to replace Claire. I only wanted Noah to be happy again." "You're not replacing her, Grace," he said softly. "You're the one she chose, and I believe Claire would want this too." Ethan reached out and touched her hand. For the first time, she didn't pull away. Their eyes met, and for that brief moment, time itself seemed to stop. Upstairs, Noah and Mrs. Jenkins were laughing, their joy echoing down the staircase, blending into the quiet between the two adults. Outside the window, the gardenias that Grace had tended all winter had begun to bloom, pure white, filling the garden with their sweet fragrance. That evening, the three of them dined together with Margaret, Ethan's mother. Noah chattered happily about how he had defeated the dark, thanks to Grace's lullaby. Margaret said nothing at first, only looked at her grandson with tender eyes. Then she reached across the table and gently placed her hand over Grace's. "Thank you," she said softly. "Thank you for bringing my grandson's smile back." Grace smiled, shaking her head. "You don't have to thank me, ma'am. I just did what my heart told me to do." Later that night, after Noah had fallen asleep, Margaret asked Ethan to walk with her into the garden. "Ethan," she said, "I used to think Claire was the only miracle you'd ever have, but I was wrong." He stayed silent, listening as she continued. "Claire left a piece of her soul inside that woman, and if you can feel it, don't deny it, because sometimes a second love isn't betrayal, it's continuation." Ethan looked up, the garden lights reflecting softly in his eyes. "You'll support me, won't you, Mom?" She nodded gently. "As long as you keep Noah smiling, I'll never stand in your way." That night, the wind carried the scent of gardenias through Grace's window. She was writing in her journal when a quiet knock came at the door. Ethan stepped in, holding a small box. "Grace," he said, "I want to give you something." She opened the box and gasped. Inside was a pair of rings. Her hand flew to her mouth, emotion tightening her voice. "Ethan, He didn't let her finish. "You don't have to say anything. Just stay. Not for me, but for Noah. And if you can, let me stay too. Not as your employer, but as your companion." Grace nodded, tears spilling freely, but her smile radiant. "All right, I'll stay." He took her hand and slipped the ring onto her finger. Under the moonlight, it shimmered like a blessing. The next morning, Noah burst into their room, shouting with joy, "Miss Grace, Daddy, the gardenias have all bloomed. Mommy said in my dream that this is our season." Ethan scooped his son into his arms, glancing at Grace. She smiled in the sunlight, her hair fluttering in the breeze. Together, the three of them stepped into the garden, where hundreds of white gardenias bloomed in full glory, their fragrance drifting like a whisper from heaven. Noah looked up and said softly, "I think Mommy's smiling." Ethan bent down and kissed his son's forehead. "Yes, she is." Then he turned to Grace, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I think she's blessing us too." Grace took his hand, her voice tender. "Love never disappears, Ethan. It only changes form and finds its way back." And in that moment, among the sea of white blossoms, the three of them, a man who had once lost faith, a woman with a healing heart, and a child reborn in laughter, finally found the true meaning of family.